We're making great progress so far. It's time to start working on post. Before we do that, we'll have to talk about the loop first. In the resource section, I provided a link to the loop's codex page. Let's check it out. Here's what WordPress has to say about the loop. The loop is PHP code used by WordPress to display posts. Using the loop, WordPress processes each post to be displayed on the current page and formats it according to how it matches specified criteria within the loop tags. Any HTML or PHP code in the loop will be processed on each post. So what WordPress is saying is that it's just a set of functions that WordPress provides so you can display posts. It's called the loop because you actually have to use these functions inside the loop. The loop is basically an array of posts. Sometimes the loop will only have one post, and sometimes it can have several posts. It varies from page to page. It's pretty simple, so let's get started. First things first, we have to add support for featured images. In the setup function, let's call the function add theme support and pass in post thumbnails. This feature will allow us to use the featured image feature and help us generate thumbnails of various sizes. I'll provide a link in the resource section just in case you want to read up on this function again. Let's open up the index template and start using the loop. You'll find a comment that says post. This is where we will be running the loop. You'll notice I have some static blog posts. We don't need these anymore, so let's delete all of them except one. We'll be using this one as a reference. Next, let's add some PHP tags and start coding the loop. Create a conditional statement. We're going to call a function called havePost. This function has no parameters and it does one simple thing. It checks to see whether or not the current page has any posts. The question is, how does it know that? What WordPress will do is read the URL. Just based on the URL, WordPress will determine what posts should be displayed and how many. It's all handled for you. Moving on, this function will return true or false, depending on what it finds. If true, then we should start displaying some posts. Before I continue, you'll notice I'm using curly brackets for my conditional statements. Let's open up the index template for the theme 2017. You'll notice that this theme doesn't use curly brackets. Instead, the developers use the end if statement for their conditional statements. This right here is preference, and what makes your code readable to you. If you want to use this style of coding, then go for it. You won't face any performance or security issues by using endif or curly brackets. It's all preference. For this course, I'll be using curly brackets. Continuing on, we create a while loop and call the same function again. This may seem like it'll run an infinite loop, but we can fix that easily in just a moment. Before we go any further, let's go into the reading settings page. There is an option for restricting the number of posts per page. Let's set this to 4 so we can set up some pagination later on. Let's also set for each article in feed show to summary. After you save your changes, let's go back to the index template. Inside the loop, we're going to call a function called thePost. This function does two things. First, it will query the database and get the current post in the loop. Once again, WordPress is smart enough to know which post to grab. The second thing it does is check to see if there are any more posts after the current post. If there isn't, then the value returned by the havePost function will be false. This will stop the loop from running infinitely. It's very important we call this function first before we do anything else inside the loop. Otherwise, we'll end up just using the same post over and over again. This assures us that we'll get a new post on each iteration. So remember that static post I told you to leave in the template? Let's cut and paste that inside the loop like so. All we have to do now is make each part of this post dynamic. In the resource section, I provide a link to a page in the codex called Template Tags. Template tags are PHP functions that display information onto the page. There are hundreds of them, and each are simple to use. Template tags save you time by just calling them, rather than having to extract and query the information yourself. You'll see what that looks like in just a moment. On this page is a long list of functions that return information about the blog. A majority of these functions can be used anywhere in your template. You are not required to use them inside the loop. However, there are benefits to running some of these functions inside a loop. You'll see how that works in just a moment. Let's go down to the post text section of this page. You'll see we have quite a few functions that we can use inside the loop. Let's use one of these template tags now. The first one we'll be using is the post thumbnail function. Inside the loop, look for the image tag that contains the featured image. Let's remove these and instead call this function. This function will generate the HTML for our image and output it. The benefits of using a template tag inside the loop is that template tag functions will automatically detect that it's inside the loop. This function and any other function we use inside the loop will automatically know which post to grab the information from. This function has a couple parameters we can set. The first parameter is the size of the image. You can pass any number if you believe you know a good size, or you can take advantage of WordPress's post thumbnail size feature. In the resource section, I provide a link to the post thumbnail page. WordPress describes in detail about post thumbnails, but we won't concern ourselves with the whole thing. Scroll down to where it talks about the sizes available. From what WordPress says, there are 4 size aliases we can use: thumbnail, medium, large, and full. Full can be thought of as the original size. Let's pass in full to the function. The second attribute is an array of attributes that WordPress will add to the HTML generated. The only attribute I want to override is the class attribute. One class I'd like to use is the image fade class, which I added to give a cool effect. Now let's use the key called class and set its value to image fade. That's all we need to do. So let's refresh the page and check out our post thumbnail. This is great. You should see something similar to what I see. You may have different images, as FakerPress generated most of these posts and grabs random images from the internet. Some posts want to have images, and that's perfectly fine. We need to do one more thing. Not every post that is displayed will automatically have an image associated with it. We can't assume every post will have a post image. So let's wrap the link that encompasses the image with a conditional statement. Inside this conditional statement, we'll use the hasPostThumbnail function. As the name suggests, this will simply check to see if the current post in the loop has a thumbnail. If it's true, then we'll display the image. Before we continue on, I want to briefly talk about thumbnail sizes. If you were to go to the admin dashboard and navigate to settings media, you'll find settings to change the sizes of certain thumbnails. Feel free to adjust these as you like. We also have the power to add thumbnail sizes. This is something we'll explore in a future lecture. Let's finish up the loop here by making the rest of the post dynamic. Most of the functions I'm going to introduce here can be found on the template tags codex page. We're going to start from the top and work our way down. First up is the title. We're going to call a function called the title. You'll notice there's also a function called get the title. This is a common naming convention for template tags. The main difference between these two types of functions is that the get version will return the value, while the non-get version will echo out the value. The value itself is always the same. Next up is the permalink function. This function will simply echo out the URL to the post itself. Keep in mind that I'm getting all these from the template tags codex page. All these functions are available to us, and you can simply use them freely. We will actually have to use this function multiple times, as there are multiple locations a link is being used. Next up is the date. We'll be using the function get the date, and we'll be echoing out the value. There is the date function, but this function actually comes with a problem. If there are posts with the same date, then this function will end up acting funny and display the same date even after date between posts has changed. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the date function. Here is what WordPress says. Special note: when there are multiple posts on a page published under the same day, the date function only displays the date for the first post. To repeat the date for posts published under the same day, you should use the template tag, the time function, or get the date function. WordPress itself recommends that you use get the date rather than the date. The format for the date is determined by the administrator. In the admin dashboard, navigate to Settings General. Here, we can modify the output of the date. We can also modify the format through the function itself. This function can optionally accept one parameter, which is a format. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to formatting the date and time in WordPress. You can pass in any of the following, and WordPress will change the output. I'm not going to change the format, as I like to let my users determine their own preferred format. If you don't specify a format, then WordPress will use the format in the settings. Let's keep going. Use the author function to output the name of the author. Next up is comments number. This function will output the number of comments a post has. I'm going to pass in the string 0. If I were to omit this value, then WordPress will automatically display no comments if there are 0 comments in the post. By passing in the string 0, WordPress will output the string itself. I'm going to replace these paragraph tags and call the function the excerpt, which is a shortened version of the original post. It's a really great way to give readers a preview of what's inside the post itself. So far, so good. Up next is setting up the URL to the author. This one's going to be a bit tricky, as we have to use 2 functions to obtain this value. We'll be using the function getAuthorPostURL, which will return the URL to the author's profile. However, unlike the other functions, this function isn't aware of being in a loop. All the other functions will automatically use the ID in the loop. This function requires that we pass in the ID of the author. So to do this, we have to use the function getTheAuthorMeta, which will retrieve the information about the author. This function is aware that it's inside the loop. This function can return a number of values, but we're interested in the ID of the author, so I'll just pass in ID. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the AuthorMeta function. This page displays all the possible values you can retrieve using this function. This bit of code here will grab the permalink to the author's post. The very last thing we want to do is call the category function, which will return an unordered list of links of categories for each post. However, we do not want that. We want the categories to be separated by spaces. Luckily, we can pass in a string that will act as a separator. So I will pass in a string of an empty space. As you can already tell, we're just calling a bunch of functions that WordPress will take care of replacing. WordPress takes care of everything from pagination to querying the database to looping through everything. All we have to do is instruct it where we want to place the data. Let's refresh the page and see our dynamic posts. As expected, everything works. Well, almost perfect. If we take a look at some of the posts, we see these square brackets with dots inside. I prefer to have nothing at all. We'll fix these with something called filters. However, in the next lecture, we'll be focusing on pagination.